Welcome back for more AP Biology. We're going to be continuing our talk of how cells can talk to each other by talking about things called neurohormones. So in particular, how can we use the cellular communication as evidence for evolution? Namely, this is going to be all over the place, so is there evidence for that? There's something the College Board likes to test on, because it goes on forever. Hooray. So, from last time, what do cells do to communicate? We need to have three components. Component number one, we need to have a signal that binds to a receptor. Component number two, we need to have a transduction pathway. Component number three, we need to have some type of response. Every cell that we look at, if we look at a bacterium, we see this pattern. If I look inside of an animal, I see this pattern. If I look inside of a plant, I see this pattern. If I look in a fungus, I see this pattern. If I look at an organism that's somewhere in between a bacterium and a fungus, I see this pattern. If I see look at organisms that are somewhere between a bacterium and a plant, I see this pattern. If I look at organisms between bacteria and animals, I see this pattern. So this pattern seems to show up everywhere. And all those different examples turn out to have the same patterns of how we can talk. So they can talk to cells next to each other, they could talk to themselves, they can touch and talk, they could release chemicals into the atmosphere, or if they're multicellular, they could dump them into little tubes that can travel around. We use all sorts of patterns in order to communicate. The catch becomes we're now needing to talk about some specifics, and we're going to talk specifically in class, I'm not going to record them, about how do neurons work and how do hormones work and how does the immune response work. And usually when you talk about those things, we divide them into two categories, the plant version and the animal version. And it's really hard to talk about them if we don't know what we mean by plant or animal. So the catch is usually we have some type of diagram, a Venn diagram like this. So we say here are the characteristics of an animal, here's the characteristics of a plant. The catch is there is some issue with these. So like the plant side, what we notice is it says they have chloroplasts. Not all plants have chloroplasts. Or they can create food by photosynthesis. That's not true of all plants. So it's what do we mean by these things? I'm going to give you a really simple version of an answer that may or may not work, but it's going to be what we're going to go with. Plants, as long as they're alive, can keep growing. Turns out to be one of their things. If you look at how their cells replicate, they don't need a stopping point. They can just keep going as long as they're alive. Doesn't mean they're immortal, but as long as they're alive, they keep growing. Animals, we grow, and stop. There's a stopping point for us. We don't get to keep growing forever. Plants do, at least as long as they're alive. So, if I look at immune responses, what do we notice? Immune responses, so we have two terms here. One's called defense, one's called immunity. Defense would be, you don't care what the invader is, let's just stop it. We have a word for invaders, they're called antigens. If it's an invader that's going to cause you harm, we call them a pathogen. So a pathogen is an antigen, but antigens are not pathogens. Much like how we could have something that is going to be an invader that doesn't cause you harm, but you think it will, we call those allergens. Allergens and pathogens are antigens, but antigens are not just pathogens or just allergens. I know, confusing. We also have this thing called immunity, and immunity involves recognition. I know what the invader turns out to be. So if I look, well, how do I know if you are an invader or not? I need to have some ability to recognize that you are an invader. Whether you know what the invader is or not is a different story. Well, how is that possible? It's cell communication. Plants do this, animals do this. We know the animal version a lot better than the plant version because the plant version is actually involving chemical warfare, and ours is not as much chemical warfare. But they still have the ability to identify. If I look at hormones, So hormones in us turn out to have a whole bunch of different names, and they have a whole bunch of interactions. How does that work? They need to be released, and then they bind to receptors, and they cause some type of response. Plants will do the exact same thing, just theirs are a bit more nuanced. This video here, you can watch the video because you can hunt for it because you see plants can communicate with each other. So if I were to watch this video, what you will see is plants actually have a nervous system. They actually have an ability to have different interactions with cell-to-cell contact. Nervous systems have lots of cell-to-cell contact. Our brain turns out to be a couple billion cells that are all touching each other. Plants can do the exact same thing. They just happen to use the roots to do so. Well, what does this all mean? If I look at the pattern, how does all of this work? It always involves have a receptor, have an amplification, have a response. The difference that we seem to notice between all of the versions that seem to exist is how complicated are they? But if the patterns, if the three components are the same no matter what organism you look at, that's either a massive coincidence or there must be a pattern going on.